Locusts do not negotiate. They do not take a portion and leave the rest. They arrive in clouds that darken the sun and consume everything organic in their path, stripping fields in hours, devouring crops that took months to grow, eating the handles off tools and the clothes off lines and the paint off buildings, because their hunger recognizes no boundaries and their numbers overwhelm any defense. A swarm of Rocky Mountain locusts could contain trillions of individuals, could cover areas larger than some states, could deposit so many bodies on railroad tracks that trains lost traction and could not move. When the locusts came, there was no fighting them. There was only surviving what they left behind. The settlers who came to Nebraska in the 1870s knew about locusts the way people know about hurricanes or earthquakes, as natural disasters that happened somewhere else, that affected other people, that surely would not descend on their particular patch of carefully cultivated earth. They stored their grain in barns and cribs and granaries, in wooden structures that protected against weather and vermin and the ordinary challenges of prairie farming. They did not think about what would happen if something came that could enter those structures, that could find the grain no matter where it was stored above ground, that could consume in days what had taken seasons to grow. Tobias Meyer thought about it because he had seen it. In Bavaria in 1847, when Tobias was a boy of 12, a plague of field mice had descended on his village. Not locusts, but the principle was the same, a swarm of hungry creatures that ate everything they could reach. His family's grain, stored in the barn like everyone else's, was gone in 3 days. The mice found it. The mice consumed it. The mice left nothing but husks and droppings, and the particular horror of watching months of labor disappear into the bellies of vermin. His grandfather had lost nothing. The old man had buried his grain in sealed crocks beneath the floor of his root cellar, a practice his own grandfather had taught him, a technique that went back generations in parts of Bavaria, where plagues were not theoretical but recurring. The mice could not reach what was buried. The mice could not smell through packed earth. The mice starved while the old man's family ate, and Tobias learned a lesson he would carry across an ocean and apply to a different plague in a different land. He bought his Nebraska homestead in 1871, good land along a creek with soil that would grow anything he planted. He built a house and a barn and fenced his fields, and in the first year he stored his grain the way his neighbors did, in the barn, in wooden bins, protected from weather and ordinary vermin. But even that first year, he began preparing for what he feared might come. He dug pits behind the barn, lined them with stones and clay to keep moisture out, and buried a portion of his harvest in sealed ceramic crocks that he had brought from Germany specifically for this purpose. Hannah understood without needing explanation. She had grown up in the same region, had heard the same stories, knew the same history of plagues and famines and the people who survived them, because they trusted old ways that seemed foolish until they proved essential. She helped him seal the crocks with beeswax, helped him lower them into the pits, helped him cover them with earth, and mark the locations with stones that looked natural, but that they both knew were maps to survival. Their neighbors noticed the digging. Clayton Briggs noticed in particular, because Briggs made it his business to know what everyone in the county was doing, and to have opinions about whether they were doing it correctly. He rode over one afternoon in the summer of 1873, found Tobias lowering a sealed crock into a pit behind the barn, and sat on his horse with the expression of a man watching something simultaneously puzzling and amusing. "Meyer," Briggs called out, "what exactly are you doing with that jug?" Tobias straightened, and looked at the American who owned more land than anyone else in the county. "Storing grain," he said simply. Briggs laughed. "In the ground? You're burying your grain in the ground like a dog burying a bone?" He shook his head with the confident pity of success, looking down on foolishness. "We have barns here, Meyer. Buildings with walls and roofs. You don't need to dig holes like some kind of primitive. This is America. We do things properly here." Tobias said nothing. He had learned that explaining himself to confident men accomplished nothing. The grain would explain itself if explanation became necessary. The buried crocks would speak for themselves when the time came, or they would remain silent, and Briggs would be right, and the extra work would have been wasted. Either way, arguing with a man who had never seen a plague was pointless. The plague came in 1874. It came first, testing Nebraska's defenses, consuming portions of the harvest, but not all of it, teaching the settlers that locusts were real without yet showing them what locusts could truly do. The swarm of 1874 was devastating enough that families gave up and left, that farms were abandoned, that the governor requested federal assistance. But it was not the worst. The worst was gathering strength in the mountains, breeding in numbers that would darken the sky when they finally descended. The swarm of 1875 made 1874 look like a light rain before a hurricane. Everyone who laughed at his buried grain was about to stop laughing. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened next proved that old wisdom outlasts modern confidence. The locusts arrived on a July afternoon that had been pleasant until it wasn't. The sky darkened as if a storm was approaching, but the darkness moved wrong, shifted and swirled in patterns that clouds did not make. The sound came next, a roar like distant thunder that grew and grew until it became a physical force. The combined wing beats of billions of insects approaching at speeds that horses could not outrun. They hit the fields like a living wave. The wheat that had been standing tall and golden in the afternoon sun disappeared row by row as the swarm settled and began feeding. The corn that had been reaching toward harvest vanished stalk by stalk, the leaves and ears and stems consumed by mandibles that numbered in the trillions. The vegetable gardens, the fruit trees, the grass in the pastures, everything green and growing and alive was stripped bare within hours, leaving behind a landscape that looked like it had been burned, except that burning leaves ash, and the locusts left nothing. Tobias and Hannah watched from their porch because there was nothing else to do. Fighting was impossible. Saving anything above ground was impossible. The locusts were everywhere, crawling over buildings, covering fences, piling so deep on the ground that walking meant crushing dozens with every step. The sound of their feeding was audible from inside the house, a continuous rasping, chewing, gnawing that went on and on as everything the Meyers had planted disappeared into the swarm. The barn was not spared. The locusts found the grain bins through gaps that had seemed too small for entry, through cracks that had never admitted vermin before, through sheer weight of numbers that forced entry where entry should have been impossible. By the end of the first day, the grain that Tobias had stored in the barn was gone, the bins empty, the floor covered with locust bodies that had died in the feast and been replaced by others that continued feeding. But the buried grain remained untouched. The locusts could not reach it. They could not smell it through 3 feet of packed earth. They could not dig to the sealed crocks that waited in their stone-lined pits, perfectly preserved, completely protected from the plague that was destroying everything above ground. While his neighbors watched their entire harvest disappear, while Clayton Briggs saw his massive barns emptied by insects that his wealth could not stop, Tobias knew that beneath his feet lay enough seed to plant again, enough grain to survive until the next harvest, enough future to continue when others had none. The swarm stayed for 3 days, 3 days of continuous feeding, of stripping everything organic from the landscape, of transforming productive farms into barren wastelands. When the locusts finally rose and departed, following whatever instinct drove them to new feeding grounds, they left behind devastation that broke families and bankrupted counties and would take years to fully recover from. The settlement gathered a week after the swarm departed, meeting in a church that still stood only because locusts could not eat the sod walls and had merely consumed the wooden door and window frames. They came to count losses and plan survival, to determine who still had resources and who had nothing, to decide what could be salvaged from a disaster that had taken everything visible. The grain situation was catastrophic. Every barn in the county had been emptied. Every granary had been stripped. Every bushel that had been stored above ground was gone, consumed by the swarm or fouled by the bodies and waste that the locusts left behind. There was no seed to plant for next year. There was no grain to grind for bread. There was nothing but empty bins and hungry families and the approaching winter that would turn hunger into starvation if something did not change. Clayton Briggs spoke first, because Briggs always spoke first, his confidence apparently undented by the disaster that had taken his crops along with everyone else's. "We will need to purchase seed from the eastern markets," Briggs announced. "I will organize a buying expedition. We will need funds from every family, pooled together to purchase enough grain to replant and to survive until the next harvest. It will be expensive. It will require sacrifice. But it is the only way." The families murmured agreement because there seemed to be no alternative. The locusts had taken everything. The seed would have to come from somewhere, and somewhere meant the eastern suppliers who would charge premium prices for emergency grain delivered to desperate farmers. Some families would go into debt they might never escape. Others would have to sell land to raise the funds. But what choice did they have? Tobias stood. He was not a man who spoke at meetings, not a man who drew attention to himself, not a man who felt comfortable contradicting the most powerful farmer in the county, but he stood because he had something to say that needed to be heard. "I have grain," Tobias said. His German accent was thick, his English simple, but his words were clear enough. "I have seed, enough to share, buried in the ground where the locusts could not reach, enough for everyone who needs it." The room went silent. Briggs turned to look at the German immigrant with an expression that shifted from disbelief to suspicion, to something that might have been shame in a man capable of feeling it. "You buried your grain," Briggs said slowly, "in the ground, like I watched you doing 2 years ago, like I told you was primitive and foolish and unnecessary." Tobias nodded. "My grandfather taught my father. My father taught me. When plague comes, only what is buried survives." The locusts proved him right. The silence stretched. People looked at each other, processing what they had heard, understanding slowly dawning that the strange German with his strange practices had saved what their sensible American methods had lost. The seed they needed to survive, the grain they would have paid fortunes to Eastern suppliers for, was buried in pits behind Tobias Meyer's barn, preserved and perfect, and available to anyone who needed it. "Show us," someone said. The voice came from the back of the room, and others echoed it. "Show us the grain. Show us what you saved." Tobias led them to his homestead, a procession of desperate farmers following the quiet immigrant who had prepared for what they had dismissed. He led them behind his barn to the pits he had dug and marked with natural-looking stones. He removed the earth that covered the first pit, lifted out a ceramic crock sealed with beeswax, broke the seal, and tilted the container so that everyone could see what was inside. Golden wheat poured out, clean and dry and perfect. Not a locust had touched it. Not a hint of damage showed on a single grain. The seed that would save the county, that would allow planting next spring, that would prevent starvation through the coming winter, poured out of a buried crock that the locusts had walked over without knowing what lay beneath their feet. Briggs pushed to the front of the crowd and stared at the grain with an expression that combined relief and shame in equal measure. Relief that seed existed, that survival was possible, that the expedition to eastern markets would not be necessary. Shame that he had mocked the practice that had saved them, that he had called primitive the wisdom that had proven itself against a plague that his modern methods could not stop. "How much do you have?" Briggs asked. His voice was quiet, stripped of the confidence that usually characterized everything he said. Tobias continued lifting crocks from the pit, opened a second pit, and began retrieving containers from there as well. "Enough," he said simply. "Enough for everyone. I buried half of every harvest since I arrived. 4 years of burying. Enough seed for the county to plant. Enough grain for families to eat until the new harvest comes." He gave it away, not sold, not traded, not leveraged for future favors or land or influence. Tobias Meyer distributed his buried grain to every family that needed it, asked nothing in return, kept only what he needed for his own planting and his own survival. The grain that his neighbors had called foolishly buried became the seed that saved the county, the food that prevented starvation, the future that continued because one man had trusted old wisdom over new confidence. The reckoning with Briggs came privately, a week after the distribution. The big American rode to Tobias's farm alone, dismounted, and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, a posture that no one in the county had ever seen him adopt. "I mocked you," Briggs said. "I called your practices primitive. I told you this was America, and we did things properly here." He paused, struggling with words that did not come easily to a man accustomed to certainty. The locusts did not care about proper. They ate everything I stored in my fine American barns. They left me with nothing while you had everything we needed buried in holes in the ground. I was wrong. I am sorry. Tobias looked at the man who had spent years dismissing him, belittling him, treating him as a backward foreigner who did not understand modern farming. He could have refused the apology. He could have pointed out how close Briggs's mockery had come to being the county's death sentence. He could have extracted payment in pride, if not in money. "The grain is not about being right," Tobias said instead. "It is about surviving. My grandfather was right, and his grandfather before him, back through generations who learned that what you bury survives what you build for. I do not need your apology. I need you to remember what the locusts taught you," Briggs remembered. The practice of burying grain spread through the county and beyond, taught by farmers who had seen what above-ground storage lost and underground storage saved. The technique was adapted and refined, sealed containers buried in stone-lined pits becoming standard practice in regions where locusts remained a threat. The wisdom that Tobias's grandfather had carried from Bavaria became common knowledge on the Nebraska prairie, survival practices outlasting the plague that had proven their value. The Rocky Mountain locust returned in 1876 and 1877, each time finding farmers better prepared, each time taking less because more was buried, each time proving that the old wisdom worked against the new plague. By the 1880s, the swarms were diminishing for reasons that scientists would debate for decades. By the early 1900s, the Rocky Mountain locust would be extinct, the last of its kind dying without anyone noticing, one of the great natural plagues of North American history, ending not with a final battle, but with a quiet disappearance. But the practice of burying grain continued. Long after the locusts were gone, farmers in Nebraska and Kansas and the Dakotas maintained underground caches, not because locusts threatened, but because the lesson had become cultural knowledge. You bury what you cannot afford to lose. You protect against disasters that might never come, because the disasters that do come will take everything that is not protected. Tobias Meyer farmed his Nebraska homestead for another 34 years, passing in the spring of 1909 at the age of 74. He never became wealthy, never accumulated the land or influence that Clayton Briggs wielded, never sought recognition for the practice that had saved his neighbors. He simply farmed, buried a portion of every harvest, and taught his children to do the same because that was how survival worked, not through confidence, but through preparation, not through dismissing old ways, but through understanding why old ways had survived long enough to become old. His great-grandson still farms a portion of the original homestead. The ceramic crocks that Tobias brought from Germany are in a museum now, displayed alongside a placard that tells the story of the 1875 locust plague and the buried grain that saved a county. But the practice continues. There is still a stone-lined pit behind the barn where grain is buried every harvest, not because locusts threaten, but because the family remembers what Tobias taught them. You bury what you cannot afford to lose. You prepare for plagues that might never come. And when the swarm arrives, whether locusts or something else entirely, you survive because your grandfather's grandfather knew something that modern confidence had forgotten. If this story taught you something about protecting what matters from disasters you cannot control, subscribe to Wild West Retribution. We have more forgotten knowledge that saved lives when nothing else could. And tell me in the comments, what would you bury to protect it from a plague? Sealed crocks in stone-lined pits. That was the difference between famine and survival. Not modern barns, not American methods, just clay and earth and wisdom old enough to have outlasted every plague that tried to prove it wrong.